Thank you, everyone, for joining us this afternoon. My name is Nompilos Manje. I'm the Africa Advocacy and Engagement Lead at IPI. And I want to hand over quickly to the moderator of this session, Haas, who is the advisor for the OSCE Freedom of the Media. And she'll lead us through this session titled Taming Big Tech, Power, Platforms, and Press Freedom. Over to you, Julia.
Thank you so much, and good afternoon. It's great to see so many people came after the food for more food of thought. So you all, I hope, saw the brief blurb to this session. I heard there was also, unfortunately, I myself couldn't follow, but I heard there was a very controversial and confrontational conversation over lunch between a former big tech representative and the journalistic side. So this is something we will try to dive a bit further into in this conversation with a forward-looking, solution-oriented approach. As you can see, we have a stellar panel here. You all saw the biographies online, so I will not introduce them in detail, but then maybe just name and affiliation. So today, as you have seen, we want to really talk about the next steps, like how can we tame big tech? By now, I think it's not really necessary anymore to talk all too much about the challenges. We all know how big tech platforms, at least, are creating challenges or undermining journalism, from everything from engagement-driven content moderation that undermines access to reliable information, to the economic viability due to the monopolization and capture of the advertising. We also know, of course, the impact on journalist safety, but we are also very aware of the big media dependencies from on big tech for distribution, for audiences, and so on and so forth. But also, what was discussed a lot this morning, the use and misuse of technologies, and also big tech for authoritarian means. So it's really the entire spectrum is there. But in the preparation, we also kind of all said, okay, we know all of this, so let's try to move a step forward and really say, we know the challenges, but we do also already know a lot about solutions, about policy efforts, about things that have been tried, that have worked, that maybe have not worked, but why haven't they worked? What can we learn from it, right? So the intention of today is really to try to touch upon this aspect, to learn from one another, but then also to bring all of you in to have this kind of brainstorming approach to see what can we and should we be doing next, and how to also tackle the concentration of power that is very much linked to these technologies and has this additional threatening element to the integrity and plurality and independence of journalism, in fact. We also, and this is the last sentence on the introductory part, but please allow me to also still point to this last factor of the last year. We have, of course, all seen a very strong geopolitical shift, but also really additional technological development. So I think it would maybe be interesting at the outset to very, very briefly still remain on the challenges side, to touch upon what kind of is new, and whether when we move to the solution side, we have to think about new aspect with generative AI. It's not so new anymore. We have already talked a lot about it, how the increasing use of this conversational chatbots is further undermining truth, but also journalism, and generative search, of course, also, while all of these technologies are really built on the content taken from journalists without consent and compensation and credit. And now we have this starting conversation on agentic AI, and this is also something that maybe also to me is still very unclear what will come up, what are additional challenges. So maybe I would like to start off with handing over very briefly to Irene, who is the director of the AI Emerging Tech and Regulation and part of the International Fund for Public Interest Media, IFPIM. If you can help us here in this room with referring briefly to agentic AI, what are you thinking about will be the new threats? What is already possible to know about, what not? What do we have to also include in our thinking when we move towards the solution part? Please.
Sure, thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. I hope everyone is sated and full, but not sleepy, and hopefully this will wake everyone up. So I think just to answer the question briefly about what does agentic AI mean and what are the implications, I will start by saying just everyone is familiar with generative AI. It helps to summarize, it helps to answer. Where we move into agentic AI is when the technology is starting to help us with decision making, right? It's taking bits of information and then also trying to begin doing some of the processes and making decision pathways for the process, right? So it's generative AI is just summarizing what's in front. And we all know that there are hallucinations and other challenges with the technology at the moment. Agentic AI takes you one step further because there's a bit of analysis around that, right? So, but we don't. And to the short answer of where this takes us, it's a big unknown, right? But what it does mean is that it takes the content that is sort of the source material, and the output is even potentially further apart from what the input is, right? And where the humans are in the loop, how you track the decision making and what gets you to that output becomes harder to track at scale, right? So I think that this is what we need to be aware of. Now, what does this also mean? It means that enterprises, areas of life, in finance sector, in health, and other places, are going to start really trying to push the limits of where agentic AI can take us. We're already starting to see this in consumer chatbots, right? So, the vision that we often hear is, hey, chatbot, tell me a restaurant where my kid can get chicken nuggets, I can have my vegan food, and we know they have a gluten-free kitchen, right? And this magical agentic agent will one day be able to tell us all this information. We're not there yet because the technology isn't there yet, but trust me, this is where they want to go, because this is, this is where you can start making the money and where the economy really lives. For journalism, for the producers, I think that we're going to see ourselves in a place where, what we produce is going to go into, it's going to be sold and hopefully licensed, but then there will be many steps along the value chain until it gets to the consumer. So I think the question then is, what oversight as information producers we will have over that output? Will we know? And are there ways that we can be able to influence that flow so that we can ensure that at the end there will be information integrity?
Thank you so much for outlining this. I mean, there's already so much out there I would like to immediately jump onto. And maybe just to set aside, but to mention this maybe broader philosophical question about human agency, which is the underlying foundation of all human rights, but maybe this is too much for a 1-hour session. But I think it really refers to this question of what framework do we need to have in place before technology is deployed, ideally when it's being designed, right? And you spoke about this value chain, so where are the entry points, like on each level? Who decides, right? And how to make sure that this human oversight and the human agency is really safeguarded along all this way. Does any of you still want to add something on this challenge part, or should we try to jump immediately to the more forward-looking? Is there something you still think is necessary for setting the scene? No. Okay, very good. This was not a lot of time, but obviously you're more than happy, more than welcome to add throughout the conversation. But I wanted to move maybe now that we set this scene, because I think it helps us to understand many of the challenges will maybe multiply, they will get more complex even, but it's still the same questions about the power, who decides, what gets licensed even, what gets fed into a system that is being deployed, and how to make sure that the output at the end is based on information integrity. And not undermining journalism for that matter. Building on that, there is, of course, a lot of conversation about this economic aspect that Irene also mentioned on the licensing aspect. And Anya, you are director of the journalism section at the Columbia University. I think it should be getting on. Not yet. Can you turn on the microphone?
From Anya?
Yes, okay, now it works.
People hear me now?
Yes.
Yes.
Yes? Okay. Otherwise, I can put on my teaching voice and go very loud. Did you want me to start talking?
Yes,
Okay.
on this economic aspect. What are
ready.
solutions for
Sure.
viability?
Okay. Well, there's some other things I want to say too. So, yeah, I have a very long title. I run the Tech Policy Program at Columbia University School of International and Public Affairs. So
Thank
sorry
you.
for that. And I think on this question of taming big tech and power and platforms, obviously Donald Trump and the Trump administration is really changing all of these discussions. And globally, what we're seeing is very different discussions happening in very different places. So in the US, of course, we've seen, unfortunately, people like Mark Zuckerberg and many of these large tech firms totally collaborate and capitulate to Donald Trump, right? So they all gave money to go to his inauguration, they're going to dinner with him, and US foreign policy has always been about protecting US businesses, but as you all know, you all saw when J.D. Vance came to the Munich Security Forum, you've seen our repeated government statements against the Digital Services Act, against digital taxation, against even bargaining codes. And so the US has made it very clear, in terms of sort of taming big tech, the US has made it very clear that they're completely on the side of our large platforms. So the conversations we're having in the US, we're in that sort of mode right now of, oh my God, Jeff Bezos owns the Washington Post. Our big media outlets are becoming very captured. So that's kind of a US conversation. And the reason it affects all of you is it limits, or it may limit, your policy space in the rest of the world. Australia looked at replacing the bargaining code with a digital levy, and Trump immediately said, if you try that, we're going to double taxes for you. The pressure, Natalia Viana and El Clip has done a whole series on sort of lobbying power of the large tech companies around the world. So the question now remains sort of what does the rest of the world do, right? And I think it's very interesting. I come to Europe all the time, and obviously all the conversations about digital sovereignty and local news. And so there, I would say in Europe, there's sort of a couple of choices. Some of the conversation, including from Irene and other people, has been about creating sort of small niche local things. I just had a very interesting conversation with Dutch colleagues who are talking about trying to give grants to create some local tech. So I think one question in Europe is going to be, if you don't want the European version of Facebook, sort of what do you do? Will your governments be willing to do things like digital taxes, or will they be too afraid, as we've seen in many places? And then what we try to do, I think so many of these policy questions, there are many, many solutions that are already out there, including in many parts of Europe. And I'll just, before I let everyone else talk, I'll say that in our report that we just published this week, one of the things we did was really talk about the different policies in place in different parts of the world and some of the pros and cons. So we talked about viability. How do you get money to pay for news? So we have a whole list of things that have been tried. And then, of course, what we've seen in many places is that if you try to get, I personally believe that obviously Google and Facebook make money from news, and they have to be part of the solution, and they have to contribute financially. But in many places where governments have tried to impose a tax, they said, you know what, we're going to leave, right? So we've all seen those conversations in Brazil and in South Africa and other places. So if that happens, if you're faced with this threat of leaving, then which laws like must carry or non-discrimination, many of which are already in place in Europe, can we add? So I'd say the policy paths are kind of two. There's the creating your own stuff, and then you have to decide if you want to create something big or small, how much does it cost, versus how much do you want to regulate what's already there. And different contexts, different countries will have different paths for that, I think.
Thank you very much also for pointing to the policy manual the OSCE launched. As you can see, we also brought several copies, so please feel free. It's on safeguarding media freedom in the age of big tech platforms and AI, and really tries to do precisely that, to provide an overview of what policy avenues have been tried, are available, how they might work, and then really build on different contexts and different approaches. Brazil was now already mentioned as one of the experiences how there is really this increasing pressure, especially from both sides, the big tech directly, but also in collusion with an administration. So, Paula, you're the founder and CEO of Momentum, and maybe you can tell us a little bit about this experience, and also Brazil is very often now in these conversations being named as a good practice example of standing up to big tech, right, by really insisting on this part of sovereignty and digital autonomy. So if you can speak a little bit about that, and maybe also build on this point of different solutions, different entry points, and we really have to prepare on all the different levels. What does it mean? Okay. Thank you.
Thank you, Julianne. I'm super happy to be here with this panel. I think there is, thank you, I don't think it's by accident that we're talking about technology, which is a very male-dominated field, in a panel, all-women panel to talk about solutions. I think that, so I'm very happy to be here with that.
Yeah, we love solutions.
I think that Brazil has an interesting story to tell when it comes to this topic in particular. Just a very quick context for you. I think the Brazilian media market is a very historically concentrated one, with some 100-year media organizations and with a lot of barriers for new entrants. So the platforms, they contribute in a very relevant way to diversify this market. I think we need to acknowledge that. I am the co-founder of 2 digital new outlets who I wouldn't have the chance to do that if it wasn't for technology and the social media platforms. So we need to acknowledge that, because we cannot have the discussions having in mind only the global north markets. I think that for many global south countries, this was particularly important to have a more diverse media market. And with direct consequences to our public debate and with direct consequences to our democracy. So I think there's a robust, independent, plural media market has consequences to all of that. But in the past 10 to 15 years, I know that we have developed what I call a structural dependence relationship with big tech with tech companies for several reasons. I think one, related to financial transactions, all the programs, and I'm not blaming them, but the programs existed, and we started to put that money in our budgets, and it became part of our budget. It became in a moment of extremely financial pressure, it became a crucial element for our survival. I think also today, and I don't want to spend a lot of time on that, but they control a core activity of ours, which is distribution. So we have absolutely no control on how we're going to reach our audience. We have not only algorithms, but every way that our information circulates. So I think it had a lot of consequences on how, and I'm sharing this with you, on how the discussion was shaped in Brazil, because Brazil has a very strong digital rights community, which came together with the media community to start to think about media sustainability, media survival, together with digital rights. And I think that it made a huge difference when we could have that conversation together. So what does it mean to have good legislation that will also empower and make it viable a media market that is diverse, plural, and independent? Now what we are seeing with AI, to be able to talk about solutions, is that the impact is even more dramatic. So what we are seeing is the risk of having a lot of these media outlets close. So we are witnessing a moment of consolidation. So probably the large players will survive and become even bigger, and probably the small players are going to disappear. Maybe one niche, one local, but like the medium-sized players will disappear. What happened in Brazil? We started to have a series of legislation that were very important. We had a bill that was named the Fake News Bill that had a provision for remuneration of journalism. This bill wasn't even voted because of the lobby coming from the tech platforms. Very strong lobby. And I must tell you, in my previous life, I used to work with the gun industry lobby. So I think that dealing with the big tech lobby is even harder because they are nicer. And it's true. It's a lot of nice people. Many of our friends, they're extremely intelligent, and they have a lot of money. So it's really hard to be articulated and be able to deal with this kind of lobby. And the bill wasn't even voted. Now we have several bills that were, or 3 bills that were structured from the lessons we learned. And I think that one lesson that is very important, we need to be ready. And we need to be ready on several fronts. We need to have legislation. But if we have legislation, we need to be discussing things before it's voted. What is journalism? We were discussing on the day before the bill was about to vote, what could be called journalism? And journalists refused to come with a definition. We cannot define what is journalism. Well, I think we should. Because if we don't, our congressman will, or some tech platforms will. So we need to come with like what can be called journalism and what can't. How much does our content is valued? We don't know. Anya did a first research attributing value to our content. This is one of the biggest challenges of the publishers. So okay, the bill is approved and we're going to have the money coming to a public fund. Who is going to manage this fund? What's the governance of this fund? We cannot be discussing this once the bill is approved. We need to be discussing this before. So one thing, we shouldn't be going against an agenda of the content producers or the artists or the musicians. Let's work with them with a version of copyright that can serve all of us. So these were all lessons that we learned that I think that put us in a much better position to draft an AI bill that is much more in favor of journalism nowadays and has a bigger chance of being approved. There is one specific issue, which is copyright, and we can discuss further. It's very delicate, but I think that we learn a lot from these processes, and I think now we have a wider coalition that is more capable of not only approving, but implementing a legislation that will contribute and favors not only certain big players, but the whole ecosystem. Maybe I'm being too optimistic. I will control myself. But yes, I think it's we're there. We're getting there, at least.
Very good. I mean, I think optimism is very often lacking in this conversation, so it's fantastic that you're so optimistic and you're spreading this optimism, hopefully to the room, so nobody feels disenfranchised. I think one point that you mentioned in the beginning that I found very interesting. It links in this direction, like how can we find a solution as a society if we don't control kind of the information space? And I think this is really the point of the media itself should have the intermediary role of public discourse, but now it's big tech with in a monopolistic and revenue-driven way. So to regain or reclaim the spaces, you need to prepare on several fronts. You mentioned. You also outlined very, very nicely, I think, how it's interconnected. The question of viability and the question of like who controls the information space and visibility and all of these points. One point I think would be a perfect leeway, back to you, Irene, and sorry, Hanna, I will give you the floor immediately after, but you spoke about defining journalism, which is really, I think, has been for a long time a red flag for many reasons, including for us at the OSCE. We always refer to public interest information and working in the public good and all of that, and I think that's also kind of the approach that IFPIM has been taking. But at the same time, you, of course, have a definition, or you have criteria, let's put it that way. So maybe you can build on that and briefly tell us about the approach that IFPIM is taking with regard to defining what is public interest media, but also maybe to build on this coalition building. I think this was an interesting point because you also, of course, spoke different region, different challenges, different opportunities. So it would be really interesting to hear from you on that.
Sure, thank you. So obviously at the International Fund for Public Interest Media, we are intending, I have an equally long title and organization, Anya, that no one can remember, but we want to fund public interest media. And in order to do that, you have to define it, right? And I think that I will just talk about a few of the principles, right? First, we made a point to say media, so we have a broader definition of it can be text, it can be photos, it can be video, it can take many forms. When we speak about this, I think that probably what we could say is we are focused on information that serves the public interest, and embedded in that is the contextual importance of culture, of language, of the local context in helping to define that, right? There is no single definition, standard, the rules of the road that we kind of tick a bunch of boxes and say, okay, now you fit into the box of public interest media. Everything, when we are doing our analysis, is embedded in understanding the context from which this organization, this information is created. Understanding that there are constraints on the production of independent journalism, and they vary. Sometimes they're physical, sometimes they're legal, many times, and I think the focus for us is the limitation that is economic. And so, that's I think, and we are guided, we are actually quite a small team within the International Fund. We partner with organizations that are thinking about these issues and what public interest journalism means in markets, and really rely on those partnerships to help us to think through what that definition means in a particular place, because we acknowledge that the context really, really matters. And so I think that that's really important when we talk about what Paula was mentioning, which is what do you, how do you define journalism? Who do you want to define it? You don't want government necessarily. You don't want the tech companies necessarily. So who? Which means, I think it really means that the industry has to come together. Self-regulation is an important part of this, and I think that is something that we have to acknowledge as well. And I will just put this out there because I do get very concerned that in this resource-constrained environment, there is a closing of ranks. Those influencers, those creators, there's a lot of othering that we're seeing because everyone is trying to survive. But people, users, they don't make that differentiation. And if we don't stop othering and we do not create a broader tent that can potentially envision new players, different players, we will become an extinct species. We have to evolve.
Years ago when I did our first Saving Journalism conference, which of course everyone's invited to, we brought in someone who I think had run the Swedish Media Council, and her piece of advice was do not try to define journalism. They said, we spent 1.5 years on it, and then we realized it was impossible, so don't bother. So I don't know, maybe I should put you in touch with her, and she can try to talk you out of defining journalism.
No, I think the journalists, I think that it's I don't want externals to define it, but I think that we need to at least identify who we consider, because otherwise we're in this paralysis where it's like, okay, well, how many times have tech companies said, do you want us to be the arbiters of truth? And then the question then is, well, do you want the government to be the arbiter of truth, right? It's like, I understand it's tough, but we have to.
And maybe what we could do also is that come together with a solution that's we cannot define, but the thing is, when we're about to vote a bill is the worst possible moment for us to have to define. So I think it's more of having this conversation are we capable? Are we including other people like Irene? So are we using a broader definition? But this is what I mean when I say we need to be ready, is that we need to take into account that all this information is going to feed the decision-making processes.
Yeah,
And also, I think it's important
Yes, yeah.
to recognize that we are not starting from scratch here. I mean, I think there is also, and this is the perfect link to journalistic association and professional journalistic standards, which had precisely this purpose for so many years, right? And which were established by the industry itself, like the media industry, and also the European Court of Human Rights. I mean, we always refer to the function of journalism. So it's maybe not so much about defining journalists, but really speaking about what is this public interest journalism function. And that obviously leads perfectly to you, Hanna, the General Counsel of the German Federation of Journalists. And maybe in addition to building on this, it would also be interesting to reflect on what we talked about, like this coalition building, also with what is the role of like a journalistic association, and like to really come into this conversation from that perspective.
Yeah, let me first of all put one point on the top, like seen from a journalistic perspective, the problems we face at the moment. The biggest problem is, of course, the question: how are we going to finance journalism in the long run? First, the internet came up, and people started to get used that they get their content for free. Then we faced the social media platform area, where the social media platforms actually closed the system and said, well, you can't outlink anymore, so you have to produce extra content if you want to be in social media, but you had to be in social media, because if you were not, you will not achieve your users anymore. And now we face AI, and people like companies, newspapers, they invest in a big research, let's say Panama Papers, they pay journalists for months, maybe even years, to make a research, and then it's republished within 3 seconds. And the user doesn't click, of course, not anymore on the page of the Süddeutsche Zeitung or Tagesschau or whatever BBC News, but they just read the summarization or the summary of the content, and if they don't click on the page, of course, the paper can't make any ads, and even if it's a public TV station, nobody's going to know, oh, this was researched by the BBC or whatever kind of public TV station. And then, of course, the will to pay for it is going to decrease, of course. Mm-hmm. So, but coming to the question, this is this quick problem summary from the perspective of the Journalists Association. But coming to the solution, I think we should also think about, well, is this completely new what we face? And is this so different to the world than we lived in 20, 30 years ago? And how did we face these problems we're facing now years ago? And for me, it's interesting to read, I'm a lawyer as well, so for me it's interesting to read old court decisions that haven't known anything about AI, social media platforms, not even the internet. And there's some sentences that are very simple, and I think they just need to be transformed from the analog area to the digital area. Let's say one sentence, the court always said, the federal court in Germany, they always said, like, there is no media freedom with media monopolies. Mm-hmm. So you may have to make sure as a governance that there is no monopolies in the media sectors. But what we're facing today is we have dealing with monopolies. For example, there's a law regulating TV platforms, and it's not allowed have a reach more than 30% of the audience. If you do, you're gonna have to be split up. So why don't we have a law like this just for social media platforms, especially since they're not only in one country, they are worldwide, dominating what we see, what we don't see. Second, another example is liability. I mean, I have an interesting example. Like just before the election, Friedrich Merz wrote a really angry letter to the Spiegel, one of the biggest newspapers in Germany, and said, like, well, there's a reader's letter, and this guy wrote that I was a teacher in St. Gallen, and my what I said was really bad, and nobody was lousy, and no students wanted to visit my seminars. This is bullshit, I've never been there. So one day later, the Spiegel took away the reader's letter because it was all actually bullshit. If the same letter would have been published on Facebook, Instagram, or whatever, you don't really believe that this person would have been able that Friedrich Merz would have been able to go against social media like Facebook in Ireland or whatever to get rid of this reader's letter. So And this is only due to a privilege given to the platforms. And I wonder, why don't we touch this privilege? I think many problems would be solved, and we wouldn't need, for example, what is regulated now in the AI with a flagging system, that we have to define what is actually media, what is good media, what is public value, and so forth. If there would be liability, I think all the problems that we face would be erased, and there have been. I mean, this was the way we touched problems in the old world, in the analog world. A third example is copyright. We've already mentioned it. I mean, in the old world, or in the world before AI, it was very easy. You publish something, and then you have to be asked, can I use it? And for what do I have to pay for it? So these two questions needed to be made clear before you use the stuff. What the AI companies do is they say, like, oh, we refer they say there's a text and data mining exception. They say, well, this is what we do, the AI training is actually based on this exception, and what we do is just use the content without consent, without any payment. And of course, it doesn't work like this. And I think it's just very simple. Just go back to the old rule and say, well, before you use somebody's content, you have to first of all ask this person, and second, pay this person. And then we don't need a very complicated tax system transforming the money and then giving and then defining who is media, who is not media. And then, of course, it also depends on the governments that are actually giving the money away. No, if we had copyright and working copyright rules, then automatically the money would go from those who use it to those who produce it.
Okay. So just this radical idea that you own what you produce. But I think it's great that we have, like, we started before with optimism. Now we have heard everything is already out there. So kind of, it's not only we discuss solution, but we kind of agree it's all already out there. So Paula, what's the next step?
Yes, no, I only want to point that I think that the monopoly can come in different shapes, because you can also talk about a monopoly when it comes to media groups. So we need to take into the consideration that in certain markets, you can also have a monopoly if you have, like, huge media groups. And I think that it needs to be taken into account also when we think about copyright, because LLMs, they need a certain amount of information to be provided. And that's why these companies are signing licensing agreements with specific companies and not with everyone. This is why we need a legislation that protects the ones who are not signing these licensing agreements, because they need to be, they need to be part of this conversation. So I think the challenge for us here, in addition to guarantee that people pay for the information they are using, and they need to pay. And I think that we need to question the argument that some of these artificial intelligence companies are making, that journalism is a bunch of facts put together. No, it's work, and it's work that has legal liability, and that's why they use our work. It's because they know they can trust, and we can be, and it can be legally sure of that. So, but in addition to that, I think there is issues like how can we keep diversity, how we can keep a plural ecosystem. That's why, and I'll finish here, I think that one, exclusive licensing agreements won't work. I think that big companies, they think they're doing a great job signing these agreements. They're not. They're maybe getting a payment for the next 3 years. You're ruining the whole ecosystem. You're ruining the place that you won't exist anymore. So have a long-term vision. What do you want to build in terms of how people are going to consume information? So think about the collective, because we will only exist together. You won't exist by yourself. So I think this is a vision that we need to have. And the other one is like, okay, if we have legislation and we have everyone just going to be, how are these people going to be paid? How are we going to track which content is being used? How are we going to pay the big guy? How are we going to pay the small publisher? We need to figure that out. And this involves also technology. So if we don't also invest in innovation that serves our industry in order to keep this plurality, we are not discussing enough solutions to keep this ecosystem vibrant and alive.
There's collective societies existing that actually are there because of the small parts of those who can't deal with whatever perplexity AI or the big companies. So I think they are in the system. It's already there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah.
If I can just jump in on this, though, I think that completely agree. I do worry that if we do everything right, we get the system set up, the math still may not math, okay, on this. Because in the same way that analog advertising, print advertising, the amount of income and revenue you could generate was much higher than digital. Like, I believe that we should be doing all the things to ensure that, content producers have their rights, they control how their information is used, they should be remunerated for that content. Journalism is a human endeavor. It can be optimized to a certain extent by technology. It is expensive, and the more things automate, the more that will go offline. So it will require more humans and more effort to get information. And by the way, we're going to talk about solutions. If anyone is running a data, like a media organization, may I please request that you should build in a business vertical to try to look at all the data that's available in your community and figure out a way to digitize it and structure it. And get ready, because the agents are going to be national, global, national, regional, local. If you have the data and it's structured, you will be in a much better position in the future, right? But to the point of how do you ensure then that journalism as a very costly exercise can continue and thrive? This is something that keeps everyone at the International Fund up at night. And that's where we have to think about investment, whether it's from the public sector, the private sector. So many facets of our society rely and are improved because of journalism. The Forum for Information and Democracy recently published a report that included 13 economists, 3 of whom are Nobel Prize-winning economists, talking about journalism as public infrastructure, reliable information as part of the future. And I think that we need to really have those economic arguments and get more of the society in all the sectors to really believe that this is something that needs to be built in further.
Thank you very much. I would really like to build on this investment point also with the link to innovation. So this question of how and who, and also the responsibility of the media. But we still have about 15, 20 minutes. So I also really want to enable people from the audience to contribute to this conversation and also ask questions. So I see already one hand up. And then, or maybe do you want to first jump on the
point of information?
Yes.
Doesn't the implementation articles of the EU AI Act include compensation? Right?
No, that's the drama. It doesn't. We were lobbying for it, and we asked it needs to be make clear that the text and data mining does not apply to the training, and especially not to the grounding. But they said, no, this is the wrong time, and it's already so complex. And at least, what we do is we have transparency rules. That's the only thing in the AI Act.
Exactly.
But then they said, and how they look like, this is going to be decided by the EU Commission. And what happened? The EU Commission made a code of practice, and and what was in there, they said 10% of the content has to be transparent. What does it mean for me as a lawyer, not as a lawyer, as a journalist, when I want to go to court and say to OpenAI, well, pay me for the content you used? They say, well, can you prove it? I didn't use your content. I used everyone's content, but not yours. And in court, you have to prove it. But if there's no transparency, and if there's only the rule that only 10% must be transparent, of course I can't prove it. So, and that was also an example for this massive lobbying, because it is of no interest for the Europeans to actually have no transparency. But it was very obvious that in these working rooms, everyone I know who was inside these working rooms, they said it's huge. The influence of the big tech companies is just so big, and obviously they succeeded.
Well, obviously, AI overviews isn't accurate because I was looking on my phone to try to get that information.
And it's
Thanks
also,
for clarifying.
The AI Act is a product liability rule way more than like addressing the business model, just like also the DSA, right? Doesn't touch upon the core business model that lies on the platforms. I will now go quickly to the 2 questions on this side, and then we can continue the conversation on investment. Yes. In the first row. Here in the first row.
Thank you so much. My name is Nick Williams. I work for Index on Censorship, and it's a really fascinating panel. I'm normally quite doom-mongery about tech, so this was actually really interesting to have a very nuanced conversation. I did want to push back a little bit on Hanna's point about liability. We work with a lot of people in areas, very repressive areas, where social media can sometimes be the last little vestige of being able to produce anything. Like an Iranian rapper who we worked with, who's banned from performing and can only perform on Instagram and social media. Smaller outlets in other parts of the country, because they can't get licensed, they're not able to produce something in a more formal setting. And last year I did a lot of work in India, and India has been pushing so hard to remove safe harbor provisions and to establish liability, or to undermine liability shields for social media platforms. As soon as Facebook is criminally or civilly liable for its content, it will gut everything that is deemed to be sensitive, contentious, which would predominantly be marginalized communities or people who hold sort of viewpoints. It's totally untenable. And when we talk about this, it won't give more control back to the users, it will give more control to the state. That's why India was trying to do it, because they have a very established heckler's veto system set up, that as soon as this we open up, there'll be routes in from these sort of semi-quasi-formal structures to be able to push pressure on the platforms. DSA did not touch safe harbor provisions in the e-commerce directive. DSA is not perfect, but it's the only way that you can guarantee and protect free expression on the platform for everyone. And I'm not saying that big tech are blameless, but India really weaponized big tech bashing towards a model that really strengthened state control over platforms.
Thank you. I mean, yes, of course, any regulation has this inherent risk of misuse as well. I will maybe just collect a few statements because I see there are several. So there are 2 more on the same side. The gentleman in last row was first, and then we will also go to this side. Yes, I see there's also a lot of comments.
Thank you very much indeed. My name is Tom Ragg. I'm with the Association for International Broadcasting, but probably more importantly, I'm a very old journalist. And I want to say thank you rather than ask a question. In my world, a lot of journalists are screaming that there is plenty of legislation and regulation around, which has existed for years and still exists in the broadcasting world, that can be used to solve a large number of the problems. Not all, but a large number. So why do we not do that? So Hanna, thank you very much indeed for voicing that. As an old journalist, and I know many people from my group would actually support what you say. Thank you.
Thank you. Then we have a comment here.
My name is Azhar Abbas. I'm from Pakistan. As Irene just said, and then Paula, I would say that in today's world, what we are seeing, we should run away from as far as possible from defining, like what journalism is, what public interest is, because we don't want like the United States government or the Singaporean government or anyone else, any government to actually tell us what public interest is. I am from Pakistan. There's a friend of mine, editor from India. So we are editor from 2 rival countries whose government and militaries are, fighting so-called in public interest. Yeah. And both the governments are actually trying to define what journalist and journalism is in their own interests. So I would like Paula and Irene, if you can comment that should we run away from these things about defining and making definitions so that they can actually trap us, that this is what these type of people are, only journalists and who can do journalism, and this is in public interest. This is public interest media, and the rest is actually enemies of the state.
Thank you. Then we have one more statement here, and then I want to
it's a
go
lot.
back after.
A follow-up question to that,
Yes.
because follow-up observation, because we talked about fake news law, and because obviously we're talking about inside the border, the Indian government actually put up a law where they had put up a fact-checking unit to control fake news, regarding their affairs. I'm also the president of Editors Guild of India. We challenged that law because that law's entire premise was the government will become the sole arbiter of defining what is fake news. And they've defined fake, false, and misleading regarding government's own affairs. And their entire narrative was, how can you have a problem with a law that governs fake news? And we had to challenge that law. We went to Bombay High Court, not to Supreme Court, because we went to a jurisdiction where we knew that the judge would be far more empathetic towards the recognizing the wrong side of it. Finally, after a long court battle, the judge held it unconstitutional. Now, the government has tried another way to sort of create a new way to bring in mechanisms to control fake news. So the government of India is actually really throwing all its resources to creating some law to curtail fake news with the ultimate agenda of curtailing those news that are fake for them, or false or misleading for them.
Yeah.
So that's just a problem that we are facing.
Yeah, thank you for bringing this example. It's always this old question, right, of bad regulation is obviously potentially even worse than no regulation, but we also all agree that the current ecosystem is not helping.
Can I quote Paula?
Yes.
Yeah.
Or you quote Paula.
Okay. Very briefly, I think this is a key debate that we need to have. I just want to say, first, our Supreme Court in Brazil just voted a change in our Internet Bill of Rights, putting more responsibility into platforms. So I recommend, we have at Momentum, which is funded by the International Fund for Public Media Interest, every single document that we publish is published in Portuguese, English, and Spanish. So it's more detailed there how this change has happened and how the Supreme Court came up with this solution. But what I wanted to say, I think, have you read Careless People? I recommend you do, because the thing is, it's not like information wasn't being controlled. It's not like the algorithm, it was like just free and happening, and like what we had is like, oh, reality, and now we're coming with regulation. It was being controlled. There was clear selection there. That's what we learned. So I think that if I had to choose between a private company and a state, my mind would explode. But I mean, it is a choice that we need to make. And I still believe that a state, a legislation, I believe in public policy, I believe in regulation. But more than that, what I wanted to say is that we put this burden on ourselves to come up with impeccable legislation. And this only favors the platforms. And they say that they can break fast, break things, and we'll fix later. Do we see the difference here? We're here in we have been discussing this all the time, trying to find the perfect legislation. Whereas they are saying, let's break things and we'll fix later. So I'm sure there will be consequences, but we have done already. We went to a series of election cycles in Brazil with absolutely no regulation. And we almost have a coup. So we know what happened when we have no regulation. Let's try to come with the best regulation that we can and find out what happened. Because we saw already what happened. And what happened was a lot of mis and disinformation and a lot of political violence and almost a coup in Brazil. So I don't think, we are not saying that we are in paradise and let's run some risk. We are in a very delicate situation, and so let's run some risks.
Yeah, I want to take this last statement, and then also, because we don't have too much time, really enable all of you to still end on a kind of next step notion, please.
I will be quick. I'm Kolja. I run a hosting and infrastructure company based in Iceland. So first, the German constitution, for example, does not define who is a journalist, and I think that's for good reason, out of history. The second part is, if you do indeed go strong for reliability, you have to keep in mind that the core infrastructure, which will going to host your website where you put your newsroom on, the first day they'll get a letter from the lawyer because they are liable, that will kick you off. So you will run into killing most of the so-called invasive journalism area. So you will shoot your own leg heavily because nobody's going to host you if he's liable for your content. I understand that you want to tackle, obviously, social media and so part, but if you tackle the underlying part by accident or on purpose with it, you will end up killing invasive journalism. Leak platforms, social media, free media. India is a good example. I got personally letters by the Indian government who put me on an arrest warrant for hosting the Reuters article that got taken off in the US by forced Indian government about their own hacking company. So, and DDoS Secrets, as a publisher of last resort, published a copy of it. But the only reason it's still online is because, well, I don't care that I can't travel to India anymore. But that's something you really should keep in mind. So from a perspective of non-tech or maybe non-legal part, I understand it. But in practice, it will, kill a lot of invasive journalism platforms.
Thank you for bringing in also the infrastructure element. We have 5 minutes left, so I would really like to go around to each of you to reflect on what we've heard from the audience, but also to give a kind of last concluding remark.
Yeah, I mean, this point is obviously the one that is actually keeping us away from platform liability that came out of that direction. But what we're facing now is actually that they made a business out of spreading fake news. And I think this shouldn't be a business model. This should not be allowed. They're making the more money, the more lies they spread. Because lies are getting the biggest attention. And I don't think that those would suffer that actually do really well-searched journalism, because well-searched journalism, of course we just started, we just have this SLAP guideline in order to stop like unjustified accusation of journalists. It's also a problem. We have to face that. But the better I research, the less likely it is for me to get actually dragged in court. And we can also help them. And I'm pretty convinced that this conversation is also driven by the big platforms. I mean, all these bloggers, are they afraid that they get dragged to court? I mean, the thing is that we have. I mean, and another example is that especially, I just read a book about those who actually worked in countries that, for example, Turkey. In the beginning, that Facebook was actually one of the opportunity to get in touch with the audience, and then they just shut down the account, just like this, without any, and in a very sensitive point. So we have monopolies there. They're controlling. They're allowing people to speak or not to speak, and that's not okay. I think we have. I mean, it is sure this discussion is not at the end. There's like problems to solve, but I wanted to say that the old principles have been proven and worked for many decades, and now we're facing many problems, and we're trying to fix them. And I just wanted to say maybe the old system worked for decades, is well proven, and maybe we have a problem that can be solved with old solutions that have been already proven.
Thank you.
Wow, this is really powerful and interesting. I guess I feel like I've been in these conversations for decades, and this is such an old argument, right? The Americans, the Africans, Latin Americans always said, we don't want government anywhere near anything. We'd rather get our funding from a foundation or from Google. And the Europeans said, actually, we have systems that work, right? So this is sort of an age-old dilemma. Agree completely with Paula. I work in a policy school, so we know it's trade-offs. There's never a perfect policy. And every single thing you can think of, somebody will misuse somewhere. I've edited 3 volumes on media capture, reports on how dangerous government advertising is. Like, we've seen all of this over decades. We have so much evidence. We also know that things can work, and that it's often a question of political will. And we also know that when a Trump comes along, nothing's going to work, whether it's, private ownership, whether it's government funding. So I do think it's important not to get too hung up on perfection because it can all be destroyed. And this is going to sound so corny and stupid, but one thing that's really keeping us all going, you're seeing I'm wearing this button about hands off our students. I'm at Columbia, which has really been the epicenter of the attacks on students and on scientific funding. And it's been obviously a terrible time. Yesterday I was on the tram and somebody came up to me on the street and just said, thank you for fighting. And what I'm seeing in New York right now in the US is that communities become incredibly important. People just want to get together. They just want to talk. So many of you have lived in these terrible situations, so you know about that. So even though we've got all this disagreement, I do think we're family. And I do think it's really important for us to get together and have these arguments. So thank you.
Yes. Oh, yeah. Thank you very much.
It's hard to follow that, Anya, honestly. But I'll just put a few thought bubbles out there on this, which is I think right now, because it feels so real and it's been so painful, that we all are still in a very, we're in a reactive to social media mindset. Like the way we think about technology and the problems that we're facing and the existential threat to media is very much from the mindset of, network effects, big tech, and scale, and how we were so powerless to fight scale. And personally, I think that, number one, there's still community radio. IFPIM funds community radio because there are many communities in this world that don't have reliable access to the internet, right? It is cumulative. We have to think broadly about all the different options and ways that people are getting information, which means that so much of the solution has to be locally based. The other thing I'll say on this is that personally, when I think about the future of generative AI, chatbots, agentic AI, I'm just not convinced that scale or that you need an open AI level amount of investment to come to a solution that will actually be very useful to the person who lives in a given community. Because DeepSeek showed us that you can build a pretty darn good LLM without spending the billions and billions that OpenAI is building. We have seen that you can do amazing things now with the technology that already exists, and that when given these options, we're in these types of technologies, we are breaking away from network effects. We have dealt with really, really, really mediocre social media products for the longest because our friends and families were there and we wanted to know what was going on and we wanted to see the pictures of the kid or whatever, right? In this new way, people are getting information. Yes, I will have that, but I'm also going to do it on chat apps, and I'm also going to, ask my chatbot. We can choose better products that work better for us, that are centered around culture and language, that can delight and understand inside jokes and references. We can build better products and we don't need to build foundation models to do it. The key is that we as people who care about information and quality and veracity need to convince whoever has the money to invest in this, invest in us, and to help us to build these lightweight, scrappy solutions that are myopically focused on the user so that we can really deliver a high quality product, because I think a lot of people can choose, they will be able to choose, and we should offer them something else.
Thank you. Paula?
Okay, just one small clarification. When I brought the definition of journalism, it's not because I said that we should do that, but it's that we need to be prepared because this is a question that will be asked. So, although we know it's hard, we're going to be confronted by that. But what I wanted to say is that working with this community, I think that one thing that keeps me optimistic is that we are very passionate. And when I'm talking about this community, it's a very large one. So I have these discussions with Irene, with Anya, with Richard, with a lot of people. We don't agree on everything, but I know that we are very passionate about it, which makes me think that we are going to find solutions step by step. I like a concept of productive friction. I think that we need to create friction. The relationship between media and the platforms, it's marked by a huge asymmetry of power. We won't be able to get rid of the platforms. I don't think we want that. As I started my participation here today, they enabled the diversification of the media ecosystem in a country like Brazil, but we certainly need to reduce this asymmetry of power. And I believe that we can do that by creating some productive friction. I also come from a country that is one of the most unequal countries in the world, where public policy has transformed the country. In many areas, we have a health system that is universal and free. Money goes from the federal government to the more than 5,000 municipalities of Brazil. It's extremely complex. Why can't we think about a public policy that is equally complex, that can ensure that media can survive? I think that we have a huge task ahead of us. That's why I think we need all of us. I think that I won't be able to take into account what if you are a tech entrepreneur, what are you worried about? But I certainly want to work with you. And just to finish on an optimistic note, we recently approved a bill in Brazil that deals with technology regulation. The bill was stopped for more than a year. And the reason it was approved was because a YouTuber made a video talking about child sexual exploitation on YouTube and other platforms, and it went viral, and the bill was approved. How did this YouTuber produce this video? It's a 1-hour video. I'm sure that he produced that using journalism and using research. So he's using our work, still very powerful. He has the power to distribute that. So we're still very relevant, and we still can change things. So I think that what we're doing is trying to find the ways to do that.
Thank you very much. I think there were a lot of super strong closing comments, so I'm not gonna summarize also because we're already ahead of time. I just want to underline 4 things that I'm taking from this fascinating conversation, which was really helpful. I think let's not shy away from complexity. It's complex, but also we are not starting from a neutral point. It's not a level playing field, so we don't have to find perfect solutions. There will always be trade-offs, but we have to find improvement. The second point is that there are solutions out there policies out there, so please take also this policy manual where some examples are in there, but there is obviously a lot way more. And things work, we have to learn from one another. The third point I'm taking is we have to think broadly, ambitiously, creatively on all levels. And we all have a responsibility also to choose, but also to invest and to provide choice. Coalitions are essential. And the last point on this, like, be inspired, be optimistic, be passionate. We have to keep on fighting all together and take one step, each of us at a time, and then we will get to a better future where we have agency and human agency. And with that, I would like to close and welcome you all to join me in thanking the fantastic panelists. Thank you.
Thank you, Julia.